Hi, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us tonight for Kennedy Krieger Institute's Exploring the Brain webinar series. I'm Dr. Brad Schlager, President and CEO at Kennedy Krieger Institute. I'm a pediatric neurologist and developmental neuroscientist, and I'm a professor of neurology and pediatrics at the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. At Kennedy Krieger, I have the privilege of leading a team of more than 3,000 dedicated, mission-driven staff members who, together, make it possible to provide clinical care and education for more than 27,000 unique patients and students each year. Because this might be the first introduction to Kennedy Krieger for some of you, let me provide a bit of information about our nonprofit organization. So we're nearly 90 years old. We're based in Maryland with our primary campus in Baltimore, but with multiple sites located throughout central and southern Maryland. And while we may be best known for our clinical services and research, it's important to know we also have 5 schools that serve publicly funded students who are referred to us by local school systems from throughout Maryland and DC. And these are students whose educational and clinical needs are not fully met by the local school system. So as an organization, we understand that for children and teens, especially those with disorders and disabilities related to the developing nervous system, that's the brain, spinal cord, nerve, and muscle, clinical care and education are inextricably connected. And that's a good lead into tonight's webinar, whose topic is how screen time and social media affect a child's developing brain. Now, as we all know very well and experience daily, information in today's world is increasingly delivered via some form of digital media, which means on a screen or electronic device, for example. So this evening, we want to focus our discussion on social media, on video games, digital entertainment, and forms of engagement that can cause concerns about the effect of those mechanisms on a child's developing brain. And while we certainly recognize that much digital content is valuable and education and even therapies are enhanced by technology, I mean, here we are together tonight via digital technology, but our focus this evening is on the problematic, how a child's age, developmental status are factors, and how to recognize if a line is being crossed from healthy use of technology to that which might be considered harmful. So we assembled an extraordinary panel of behavioral health experts to discuss this topic, a topic that's very much in the news and on the minds of parents, of educators, of healthcare professionals, of policymakers and government officials, and beyond. Now, before I introduce our panel members, let me first provide some guidance on the webinar logistics so you can get the most out of your participation in this evening's webinar. If you have a question at any time, please use the Q&A button, which is likely located at the top of your Zoom window. Click and then submit a question. And we'll try our best to get to all of the questions during the Q&A period that will follow the expert panel discussion. This webinar is being recorded, but your video won't ever be shown on the screen, nor will we identify who asks the questions. And the intent is for the planned discussion to be about 60 minutes, with roughly 15 minutes at the end for Q&A and discussion. Again, your video and audio will be muted during the webinar, so please use the Q&A feature if you have questions. So now let's introduce our expert panel with 3 of my exceptional colleagues from Kennedy Krieger. They are Dr. Matthew Edelstein, a clinical psychologist and behavioral analyst. He's the director of the Brief Treatment Clinic in our Department of Behavioral Psychology at Kennedy Krieger. Matt's also an assistant professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. Dr. Bushra Rizwan is a pediatric and adolescent psychiatrist in the Center for Developmental and Behavioral Health at Kennedy Krieger. She's also an assistant professor of psychiatry and behavioral sciences at the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. And Dr. Joseph McGuire is a clinical psychologist and director of psychological services in the Center for Developmental Behavioral Health at Kennedy Krieger, and he's also an associate professor of psychiatry and behavioral sciences at Johns Hopkins. So let's jump right in. Joe, you're first. Let's talk about what types of digital media are out there and what types are we really concerned about?
So, Brad, thank you for that kind introduction. And I think you kind of, in that introduction, brought up a lot of the most concerning digital media or platforms for digital media. These are things like video games, social media, and online streaming services that a lot of children and adolescents engage with on a regular basis. This can be on your computer, Chromebook, or tablet device. In terms of the types of media, I think parents and kind of even young people themselves can be concerned about a lot of them, and I think we'll talk probably more throughout this entire time about what that level of concern is. But I think in general, it's when you find yourself doing, more time on it than you want to, or when you're spending a majority of your day on it, that might be a red flag. Just to even think about this as an example, I was meeting with a family earlier today, and the young person kind of calculated how many hours a day he was either on his tablet, on the TV, or the computer. And he's like, well, if there's 24 hours in a day and I'm sleeping for 6 of those, I'm at least on a device for about 12. And I was like, we might have a little bit of a problem here. So I think this is something that people may not necessarily think about, but we regularly come across in clinical practice.
So Matt, what is it about screen time that causes concerns? We're going to dive into this topic more completely, but let's set the tone. What is it about screen time that's problematic?
Thanks, Brad. I appreciate being here. I think there's two pieces to consider here. One, it's the content itself. So are our young people watching things that are inappropriate or that are causing perceptions about their world that aren't really true? And then the other, what is not happening as a result of them interacting with these screens? Are there other core pieces of development that are not happening because our young people are locked into their digital media?
So, Bushra, they're professional organizations. Many of us are part of, like the American Academy of Pediatrics, for example. What are some of the guidance that we're getting from those organizations about digital media use, and then what are they basing their recommendations on?
Thank you, Brad, for that question. This is such a timely topic. We see a lot of it in the news. A lot of the professional organizations are releasing statements on this, and the American Academy of Pediatrics, being one of them, has highlighted the importance of parents maintaining limits on media use and focusing on the fact that it should not displace healthy routines, and that parents should also be aware of some of the common mental health issues that can arise from screen media use.
And Bushra, staying with you, are those guidelines coming from research, from evidence basis that's laying the foundation for those guidelines, or is it more of a expert consensus at this point?
Absolutely, it is evidence-based. So those statements that are being released by the professional organizations are evidence-based, and they look at both the benefits as well as the risk and sort of help sort of weigh in on both of those aspects.
Joe, back to you. We talked a little bit, I said at the front end that there's some issues perhaps related to age of the child. Are there different guidelines or frameworks for guidelines for digital media use based on the child's age or developmental stage?
So I think short answer is, like with many things in life, is it depends, right? So there are guidelines, but also it depends on the kind of content, how many hours a day, and what they're doing. Back in the pandemic, we were on computers, for a long period of time each day with virtual classrooms, virtual therapy. So I think it kind of depends on what's going on in that person's life. The American Academy of Pediatrics puts out some general guidelines on how many hours a day, but we know that a lot of time on screens isn't great for anybody. We need to use them for work. They have great educational potential, but Matt hit something on the nail on the head a little bit. Is there's also a cost of what we're not doing when we're watching a video, stuck on social media or TikTok, which I think is something really important to consider.
Joe, picking up on the question about evidence basis for guidelines, and how much do we really know about kids and screen use? What what kind of research is out there? What's the nature of that work? Can you set the table for us on that?
Sure. So there's actually been a lot of research. So I'll tell you what we broadly what we know, and also where the nuance of what we don't know within that. So there's been a lot of research on kids and screen time, and I think the general consensus is screen time isn't great for you. You know, just thinking about one recent article that came out in the Journal of the American Academy of Medicine, the pediatrics edition. There was an article that highlighted that screen time during a younger point in somebody's life, you know, corresponds with the organizational and inattentional problems, you know, a few years later on. So, and that's just one of many talking about how screen time, you know, in early childhood leads to worse consequences or concerns later on. And I think when every parent, you know, hears that, or even when I hear that, I'm like, oh my goodness, this is really concerning. And I think we also need to kind of think about what, when that question is asked in that research study, it's a simple yes or no, or how many hours of your day does your child spend on a screen? Now, a 6-year-old is maybe watching a lot of Sesame Street, or maybe that was just me as a 6-year-old. There could be that's potentially some educational content there, versus, you know, if I'm watching another kind of show that maybe doesn't have any sort of educational values, or educational lessons, that they didn't really control for that. It was just a kind of straight correlation or predictive association. So I think in a lot of ways, while we know that it's not great, I think that we also need to think about what's on that screen when we're using it.
So Matt, I think, you know, a theme here is how much exposure to screen is too much. And I think to address that question, we need to take into account, as Joe was just making the point, that there are potentially some positive benefits of screen time. So what are the negative effects and possible benefits, and how do you put that into the framework of thinking about how much is too much?
Yeah, so you know, screens are they're everywhere, and they're an instant source of knowledge. And for a lot of our kids that we see, who are curious and excited about learning, they can be a really great resource for that end. Oftentimes it can be useful to send a child with their own question to do their own research on something accessible like Google. There are also educational content, like Joe was suggesting, that teaches us things. It teaches us to sing and dance, or it teaches us our letters. So we certainly don't want to say that screens are all bad. I do think that that type of content is really not a replacement for traditional instruction. And oftentimes when we talk to caregivers or parents about the use of even educational material, we really try to stress that engaging in that content with the child is really what makes it much more healthy. And sort of passively watching even educational content isn't really learning in the sense that we want it to be. So we want to make sure that there's an engagement, there are opportunities for the child to reflect and comment on what they're seeing, and that requires some human interaction with their caregivers or loved ones sitting right next to them. In terms of the bad stuff, you know, I think that I suggested a little bit before that social media can be challenging because it's really a place to compare ourselves to others, and in those platforms we are really highlighting our best selves, and there are lots of different mechanisms to even make ourselves look better than we are. Not me, of course, but others, and so I think that leads to some false comparisons and can really cause a lot of damage to children and young adults who are trying to learn more about themselves.
Bushra, can you comment on that same set of questions?
Absolutely. So I agree with both Matt as well as Joe. There's definitely some benefits, including one more thing that I'm going to add is globalization and how children are able to learn about other cultures. And it's really nice to sort of see them connect and be more aware of others, which may not have been the case if screens weren't as prevalent. I've also seen some benefits with reduced stigma about mental health. So that is also a potential benefit that we're seeing. Now, some of the risks that I am seeing in clinic is disruption of routine, so sleep hygiene being affected, so kids presenting with sleep issues, irritability. Inattention is another big one that is a risk with excessive screen use. So distractibility in a classroom setting, for example. The other things we're seeing are health implications, such as higher rates of obesity, both from a sedentary lifestyle, but also from not eating mindfully. And then poor self-image, I think Matt touched on that briefly.
Yeah, which was the point about sleep and interruption of sleep that I think we're talking about kids, children and adolescents, but this is really a lifespan kind of problem. If you don't mind, how do you navigate that topic in the clinical setting? Guidance around sleep hygiene and use of social media.
And so one of the things that I love telling and talking to parents and kids about is charging stations. So just as your phones and devices have to charge, it's important for your body to charge as well. So I think kind of having screen-free zones in the house, so having your bedroom, dinner table, places where you charge, so to speak, having those areas as screen-free zones is a good idea. And modeling some of those behaviors as well. So if parents can kind of demonstrate that they're also charging their devices in a separate area from like the dinner table or the bedroom and keeping those devices out of those specific areas.
Yeah, that's excellent guidance. So Matt, when you think about screens and digital content, let's dive a little bit deeper into whether there are important differences in types of screens and content. Can you comment there?
Sure. So I think we try to categorize these things in a few different ways. On the one hand, we have screens or content where we're learning something that's assigned perhaps through school, or we're reading something, perhaps a book or something that is available through a subscription model that way. Then we sort of have pure entertainment, which is a different category, but those things tend to be episodic or long form. For me, in my practice, what I find to be slightly more concerning are the platforms that have the sort of rapid succession type of consumption of content, meaning autoplay is on and the children just going from one thing to the next, or sort of stopping and pausing and toggling between screens. And then there's the video game use, which content aside, I think modern video games are set up to really continue to no end. So there's a lot of, there aren't levels. There's sort of these worlds that we exist in these games. It's interactive with other individuals. And there's no finite end, which makes it really challenging for kids to or adolescents and adults to sort of regulate their time on these devices and these games.
Picking up on that last point, Joe, how can parents help navigate limiting screen time while trying to strike a balance between its educational potential on the one hand and some of the risks and potential harms on the other hand?
Just listening to Matt and Brusher's comments, like you realize this is hard. This is not simple. When we think about digital media in a few different ways, right? In terms of setting limits on screen time for your phone, if you're going to ask your child, your son, your daughter to do something, you also need to kind of follow suit. So one of the deals that I always make with my patients and families is I'm never going to ask you to do something that I wouldn't do here. So, yes, there needs to be some limits, but also if we're saying, no, you can't have any sort of screens, in the bedroom, and we're taking our phone or our tablet and doing all this stuff at work, we still want to try to kind of set those limits and set a good example. So I think kind of setting kind of limits at home for all family members when we think about this. In terms of striking the balance, we also we want to go back to the kind of devices and also the type of content. So there's going to be some level of screen time that people are going to have to kind of do, whether you're an adult working on a laptop or you're a child and doing homework on their Chromebook. You're going to have to use Google Classrooms or platforms or whatever to upload your material. So we kind of take that out a little bit, and we know that there is a huge potential for that. If a kid is on this screen learning and educational content, absorbing information, I think that's a wonderful thing. But also, if we're on the screen and now we logged into Netflix, we want to probably set some limits on how much time we're actually engaging in, streaming services, social media in terms of, or kind of like TikTok, which is, I guess, social media still, which is different than the old school Facebook or way back in the day of MySpace. So, and Matt also touched on a really nice point about kind of autoplay or auto scroll. If we're watching, a show on Netflix, and before we even kind of go into, the next episode is already coming on before we click end, it's really hard to kind of get up because it's meant to kind of capture and engage us. Same type of a thing if you're scrolling through social media on TikTok or Instagram, those visuals, those things are meant to kind of capture and hold our attention. Even going back to video games, these open world games, there's no clear limit. You have side missions, side quests. I have a patient who is really into Zelda Tears of the Kingdom and spent countless hours finding all of these little character cubes that were hidden throughout the map. And when I was like, well, why did you do that? Is it related to the gameplay? They're like, well, no, it's because somebody hid them throughout the map. So I want to go find them. I'm like, but you spent a lot of time doing that, like multiple hours. Can we dedicate that time to your homework? So then building that system around there of putting in some structure and some support. So saying, yes, we can do the education, but also making sure that we're having kind of some limits on how much time we're spending on these other areas.
Matt, I'd like to return to a point that Bushra was making around, where the charger stations are and parental modeling. Let's talk a bit about more about the parental behavior with digital media. Kids are watching; they're modeling after their parents' behavior. Let's talk about the impact that a parent's use of digital media can have on their children.
So kids are constantly like sponges. They're picking up on, what the parents are doing and what people around them are doing. So I think it's very important to sort of model and not use the devices as sort of the more modern day pacifier, so to speak. It's important to be mindful of using the devices kind of responsibly as parents, and then modeling some of that behavior. Also, the content on there, if you can kind of have a dialogue with the child and speak about how you're using the device and content that you're viewing, sort of focusing on that responsibility piece.
Yeah. Matt, did you want to comment on that too?
Sure, I'll just add to what Bushra said. I think, part of what we do when we're trying to help families set these limits is we ask parents to report on their own screen use, and not surprisingly, their report is that they're using these devices constantly throughout the day. And so Joe also, highlights that it's really hard to credibly enforce a rule that you're not following in full view of your child. And so I think that there's the modeling piece that's very important, but there's also the communication piece. And I think, as we're becoming more of a text messaging society rather than an interactive face-to-face society, I think there's a cost to that, and I think that that we should encourage parents and caregivers to interact with their kids face to face rather than sort of texting them that dinner's ready. And that might be a shift in the way that the family's operating, but I think we have a lot of evidence that interacting with each other in person really does a lot of good in terms of establishing really healthy relationships.
I mentioned at the front end that Kennedy Krieger, we focus a considerable amount of our clinical and educational time on children that have neurodevelopmental disabilities and challenges. So Bushra, for children that have diagnoses like autism or ADHD, to what extent does screen time or digital media use influence or interact with those diagnoses and perhaps exacerbating an existing diagnosis? What do we know about that relationship?
Yeah, so the research is not conclusive on the topic, but there are some studies that have shown some correlation. So excessive screen use and the exposure to screen use in early childhood is associated with an increased risk of autism-like symptoms and potentially also worsening the diagnosis or symptoms of ADHD, especially when it's that early childhood where that face-to-face interaction and social play is important. There is evidence that is conclusive that early infancy, that really young period in childhood, use of screens can actually lead to poor language comprehension as well as expressive language skill development, because it's required to pick up language to have that back and forth communication. And so with screens, a lot of time it's like that one-way street, and so it does impact language acquisition.
Bushra, staying with you, we know, of course, that in school settings, tablets and laptop computers are just, they're everywhere. And then during the pandemic, of course, in order to just have ongoing educational opportunities, there was significant transition to teleeducation. What do we know at this point about how that type of screen time and content affected children as a consequence of that period during the pandemic and since?
Yeah, so we're seeing higher rates of ADHD being diagnosed more recently. So I think distractibility has become more prevalent and more common in the school setting, especially when children, adolescents are tempted to use their laptop for non-academic purposes, such as playing games or communicating with their peers. And so their attention span's getting a lot shorter. They're also multitasking. The term that I hear is screen hopping. They're going between screens and it's hard for them to stay on one task. And the word I hear a lot is boredom. It's hard for them to sit with that feeling of boredom. So I think screens have kind of contributed to that, especially in the classroom setting. I'm just going to touch on two more things. One is socialization. I have also heard from a lot of the kids that I see, during recess, during lunch break, they're on their devices, and that's the time when they should be talking to each other. So again, communication, practicing those social skills is being affected. And so I'm seeing higher rates of social anxiety present. The last thing I'm going to just briefly touch on is critical thinking, where kids are confessing and talking about how quickly they can get their homework done using AI tools. And so that is another area that is of concern because their brain is still developing and they should be practicing those critical thinking skills. But the use of technology, I think, is kind of taking some of that away.
No, we heard some practical tips for setting limits. I suspect our audience would like to hear some more about how you, in your clinical lives, interacting with patients and families, talk about practical tips for setting limits. Maybe each of you can comment further. So I'll start with you, Matt.
Yeah, sure. So I like to start with families by getting a sense of their own values around screen use. Because to be fair, screens are really useful for overtaxed households where caregivers are doing a lot of things and need some time to be able to do some of their own work or some of their own chores. So I start by getting a sense of, well, what is the right amount that feels right for your family? Let's start with just a general number, and then we sort of work backwards to try to figure out how do we make sure that children are getting in all the important parts of their day, of their interaction with their family members, their homework, their other things. And then we sort of find our time in there to make sure that the screen happens after those things. So sometimes we'll use the language like, first, we're going to do the things that we'd rather not be doing, and then we're going to be able to have access to the things that we'd like to do when we're finished.
Bushra?
So one of the things that I talk to families about is how the world is a changing place and these screens are not going anywhere. If anything, the kids have to know how to use them. But I think the thing that I focus on is how to use them responsibly and kind of teaching kids those skills to be able to turn off notifications. put apps into folders, sort of help learn those organizational skills so that they can use it responsibly and be successful.
Joe, you want to chime in too?
Sure. And I, just to kind of build on what Bushra and Matt already said, I think, what we'll kind of do at the outset is think about what's a reasonable expectation in terms of work time, as well as what's a reasonable expectation for kind of screen time and what type of screen during the weekday as well as the weekend. And I think when you kind of hear a little bit about what we're saying, we're not saying screens are all bad. Getting everybody to watch a family show or, I forget what kind of the thing that everybody's interested in and watching TV together and then discussing it at the dinner table or talking or having that bonding experience can still be really nice. But to something both Matt and Busher hit on is there's that social piece afterwards. Similarly, you can't just take away, all apps, a phone, kids text, kids socialize, whether it's messaging apps like Discord or WhatsApp. These are things that the people are using, but we also want to set limits on that so that it's not constantly, we're not getting those constant kind of dings and being more kind of pulled in by our phone than we are our real world. So I think those are really important things in setting limits. While it can be tough, can actually really provide a lot of support and growth in other areas.
We've talked a fair amount already about social media, but I'd like to transition and dive in more deeply. Bushra, you've already made some comments about some positive, potential positive and negative concerns around social media. Let's go a little bit further. Do you have more to say in that space of positive and negative consequences of social media applications and content on brain development?
Sure. So developmentally, kids are going through various stages in their life. And so adolescence is a period of change. And that's the age group that I work with most often. Identity formation and self-exploration, who they are as people, that's a huge benefit of social media, kind of opens up that space for them. Now, on the flip side of that, there are trends online, and sometimes with adolescence comes sort of that impulsiveness or, maybe not as fine-tuned decision-making. And so they're more vulnerable to those influences. So it kind of goes both ways. The other thing that I think Matt touched on a little bit was comparison to others. And social media, sort of blurs reality a little bit, and also curated images is what's being portrayed. And children know this, that it's not true, but they still have a hard time sort of, sitting with that. And it does affect their self-esteem. It lowers their self-esteem when they're constantly comparing themselves to others. I'm just going to mention one quick stat. The Pew Research study actually showed that 96% of teenagers are on their phone constantly. So I think not being able to turn off, I think, is another sort of big piece. Sort of that phone follows them around all day. And I think that's what's sort of the changing trend right now.
Matt, let's pick up on that. For example, this issue of comparison to others, is there a developmental window when that becomes more of an issue, different for children and for teens? And is there other parsing of developmental stage for this social media related concerns?
Yeah, so I see this being more of a concern as kids approach adolescence. Younger kids tend to use things like YouTube and video games, and that comes with its own problems. But for our preteens and teenagers, that's where they're starting to understand who they are in relation to their peers. And I think importantly, that's also where they're getting a lot of their information about what's true in the world. And so for kids who are who might feel anxiety or who are listening to their parents talk about world events, the internet is also, and social media is really where a lot of kids get their news. And because there's very few restrictions on fact checking in social media platforms, it could really cause a lot of undue stress for kids because there's a lot of sensationalism on social media.
Along those lines, Bushra, do you have guidelines that you implement clinically for what age children should be permitted to start using social media? Any guidance for that?
Yeah, I think we touched on this a little bit earlier, and there isn't a one set age per se. There is the biological age, but then there's also that emotional and cognitive age, and that can vary from child to child. So maturity can vary from child to child. A lot of platforms are suggesting 13, and maybe policymakers are kind of trying to, kind of hone in on that number. But I don't think there's enough research to say with, definitively that there is a specific age, and kind of taking into account that emotional and cognitive perspective. So I think it really varies from child to child and situation to situation. Ultimately, it's up to the parent, and I think asking questions such as, is my child responsible? Can they think critically? Are they able to ask for help? Can they navigate challenges if they show up on social media? So sort of asking those questions before determining whether a child should be on there.
Such a great point. Just to underscore, a chronological age, like how long you've been alive, is not a sufficient method for determining where you are on a developmental trajectory for cognitive, emotional, and social development. So you just underscoring your point that you really, as a parent, need to know your child, where your child is in that space, and use your judgment to make your best decision. So along those lines, Bushra, how do you think parents can best protect their children from social media's potential to be harmful to their child's mental health?
And so I think Matt touched on this earlier, that anyone can post information on social media, and there is a lot of misinformation on social media. So I think highlighting and helping children understand the potential pitfalls and the fact, it's important to be critical about what you read online, because there aren't a lot of fact-checking safeguards in place. Also, with the advent of AI, the misinformation can be spread even more faster than at the pace where things were previously. So I think sitting with the child, being able to go through the content, showing them how to think critically, talking about things that they've seen on social media together, not to make it a punitive experience, but to kind of instill that sense of curiosity, kind of asking yourself, is this real? And teaching those critical thinking skills, I think, can be the most helpful.
Matt Bushra a little while ago mentioned a Pew study that showed a remarkable usage of children and adolescents dominating their waking hours with being on screens and interacting with social media. That begs the question, are social media platforms addictive or habit forming? And actually, it would be helpful to even address from a psychologist, and then perhaps Bushra from a psychiatrist standpoint, what does it mean to be addictive or habit forming? And if it is the case, are there age-related risks for that for a habit forming in a way that overwhelms your waking hours? Matt?
That's a great question. And when we think about addiction, or when I think about addiction, I think about tolerance and withdrawal. And so certainly when we're thinking about those two factors, you certainly see that in young children who are overusing their screens. When I say tolerance, I mean that they're almost feeling like they're not getting enough. They need more and more and more. And sort of the amount that they maybe started with is no longer sufficient, and it seems like they have to keep going. So that's sort of the tolerance piece, and the withdrawal piece is the reactivity that might come from interrupted use. And so for kids, young and adolescent, and some adults I know, restricting access to screens can cause a big emotion. And so that to me fits that paradigm pretty well. And it's pretty striking to see, particularly with very young children.
So, given that, how you go about limiting time on social media is important. If you can potentially produce a rebound effect where there's greater craving, how do you calibrate the restriction for your child if you are concerned that you're dealing with addiction or habit formation?
I'm happy to start there, although certainly Joe and Bushra, I'm curious about your thoughts about this. I think, you know, I really liken some of the types of social media to some types of substances, in that the social media that kind of gives you the quickest hit of dopamine, that those types that are sort of, you're getting quick pieces of information, or there's a lot of stimuli that are kind of coming at you right away. Those are the hardest to pull away from. So what we try to do is think about screen time not being created equal. And so having, and I think I referred to long form screen time. So when I remember being a kid and watching like a whole episode of something, 30 minutes, and kids now don't watch 30 minutes of anything. But I would suggest that something episodic on a screen would be a nice step down from something that is a quicker, more active, high stimulation type of content. And so in that way, we're sort of gradually and systematically reducing the quantity of stimulus, of information that's hitting our kids' brains.
Joe, do you want to comment on that?
Sure, and I think Matt kind of, highlighted some aspects there of, not all screen time is the same. And I think the platform is going to differ whether you're using social media, and even within that, if you're using it to catch up with friends, that is one way to kind of do it. You send a message and that's it. Versus these constant kind of auto scroll ones that have 30 seconds, a minute, 2 minutes of content, and then you're on to the next one. Then basically each kind of little story or each episode, as Matt was kind of talking about, is now 22 minutes, 120 seconds. So our attention spans, and this relates to kind of what Bush was talking about earlier, our attention spans, or what we consider to be a normal amount of attention to direct to something, is getting a little bit short. When we think about, again, the developmental self, we're in adolescence, we're developing, we're not only more susceptible to kind of reinforcement, or those dopamine bursts that Matt's talking about, but we're also trying to kind of build and test our own identities. One thing that we didn't kind of touch on here is if we're playing around and testing out new things, in adolescence, there's a permanence with social media. If you go back, you can find people's, I guess it's no longer tweets, but X, that platform, the Twitter platform, or old posts. Now, you can't do that with kind of school pictures. It's not as immediately accessible. So you can't see me as a fourth grader with a bowl cut or anything like that. But you could find that all online. Or if somebody's trying to test something out and think something is cool, back when they were in eighth grade or high schooler, that same statement may not be cool 4 or 5 years later, but it's still accessible out there in the public. So I think there's a lot of different ways social media can kind of come back to really refine and shape who we are. And so I think the ability to kind of, if we're using social media in a way where we're watching PBS, Masterpiece Theater, these 2 hour long episodes, that's a lot different than if we're watching, dance trends on TikTok. But both are ways that we engage in social communication. So we have to be mindful that we can't just totally throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Bushra, one of the most vexing parts of social media has been the increased incidence of the phenomenon of cyber bullying. And it's happening at the same time that we're seeing increased suicidal ideation and suicide attempts and completion in youth in the US and outside. How do you think about, is that a correlation in time, or do you think these are related?
Yeah, I do think they're related. Cyberbullying has brought sort of the schoolyard bullying into the homes and has blurred the boundaries between home and school, and sort of made it more permeable. So, and there is data to show that cyberbullying is linked to increased risk of suicide. About 4 times, victims of cyberbullying are about 4 times more likely to have suicidal ideations. And to Joe's point, the internet is permanent. So things sort of stay on there. So if someone is bullying, it's in the public domain. It can stay on there. It's permanent. And the other sad reality is that it's anonymous at times, and so people can sort of hide. The perpetrators can hide online, hide their identities online.
Joe, could you comment on that same question, but also speak to what parents can do and what schools can and should do about cyberbullying?
So, just, Busher talked about it being 4 times the rate. I think in general, even before we talk about cyberbullying, there's an increase overall in kind of suicidal thoughts and behaviors amongst young people in today's day and age. And you can kind of look at, increases in social media use and a lot of other things that can contribute to that. And now correlation doesn't mean causation, but Busher hit a nice, hit the nail on the head with the fact that now bullying, people are constantly accessibly social on social media platforms. So somebody can be constantly kind of engaged with or interacted with. If they posted a YouTube clip or made a funny TikTok, there can be now, or Instagram, there can be a whole host of people commenting on them 24/7. So now those positive remarks as well as those negative remarks are a lot more felt. And we know that when people are on, there was a study a while back, and I forget the exact citation, but it highlighted that the more people spend on time on social media, actually they have greater depressive symptoms. Now that doesn't mean social media causes depression, but if you're making these unfair comparisons or kind of the comparison, Matt was talking about comparisons, the comparison of the ideal to where you're at, that idealized, glamorized, Instagram shot looks a lot better than what you're doing in that exact moment. So you're going to feel a little bit worse. If you're already feeling a little bit worse and social media is making us feel that way or engaging us in that way, and then now somebody's bullying you, you're going to have an increased risk of suicidal thoughts and behaviors. So I think it's something that doesn't mean it's the only thing, but it's something that's dramatically increasing, risk. You know, what can parents kind of do and what can schools do? I think schools, there's already been a huge anti-bullying campaign. And I think that's something that we need to kind of continue to push forward with. I think bullying, now sounds a little bit silly, but I think peer victimization, where you have peers victimizing other peers and maliciously, is another way to think about it. It's not that schoolyard bully anymore, but it's somebody intentionally or unintentionally, but still trying to kind of poke somebody a little bit, causing harm to them and picking at these things. What can parents kind of do? I think first and foremost, be involved, not necessarily, with their child's social media account, but I think we talked a little bit about earlier, and I think Busher said this really nicely, talking a little bit about what's appropriate social media use, what's appropriate posting, what's appropriate things to engage, and what's not okay to put out there. And I think some social media platforms now are even limiting the comments. I forget which platform even limited the thumbs up or they took away the thumbs down. So I think there's a lot of things that can be done both on a parent level in terms of teaching things responsibly and setting limits, but also in a school, trying to limit social media and social media engagements that way by, reducing cyberbullying. And also even on a company level, I think there's ways that the user interfaces can be kind of modified to make cyberbullying, peer bullying, and kind of negative remarks on there that can really affect people in a harmful way and reduce the incidence of that.
I think that those watching this webinar and maybe a later recorded version of it will appreciate having access to some resources about screen time, about digital content, social media. Perhaps you could comment on a handful of those, and then Matt and Bushra, I think if we can compile some that to make available when we send out this information with a link to the webinar after we're done, that would be great. So Joe, some resources.
I think so when I think about resources, the American Academy of Pediatrics, as Bushra mentioned, has guidelines on appropriate and amounts of screen time in general. So I think that's a great resource. Anything that's evidence-based, anything that's put out by a trusted organization or a kind of national organization or Kennedy Krieger or Johns Hopkins, any of the names that you guys know and trust, I think is huge and important. In terms of resources, there's resources to explain what the apps, what the media streaming services are, to kind of get connected to all of that. And I think we can kind of send some links around as a resource page, because to try to list, there's not a good resource because the digital media and digital content is constantly changing over time. There was a foundation called the One Mind Foundation. And back in the day, they put out a cyber guide trying to rate the evidence for every single app. And after a while, they stopped doing it because there were too many apps and too much proliferation was going on. And it was unwieldy to maintain. And I think this is one of those things where there's general guidelines put out by these organizations, but really asking your son, asking your daughter, asking your loved one, what are you doing on the screen? How are you using it? And is it problematic? I notice that you're having, it's, to Matt's point, you're antsy when you're not holding it. It's hard for you to kind of put it down and turn it off. What can we kind of do to resolve that? And can we, if we're limiting and taking away a behavior, can we also replace it with something else? So I think that there's a lot of things that we can kind of do as parents and as professionals to really advocate and make that out there. And the other last piece that I'll put out there is you have four fantastic folks on this call, not to leave you out, Brad. But also, there's a lot of trusted community members, and if parents are concerned, about their child's mental health, reaching out and making an appointment. And there's nothing wrong with getting a consultation, talking things through. And worst case scenario, you find out everything's okay, and maybe somebody's just playing a little too much Minecraft or Roblox. That being said, maybe not, and we're able to kind of intervene a little bit earlier and put together a plan to support everyone.
Joe, that's a great setup for what I think should be maybe the last question before we go to the Q&A. And I'll ask Matt, but I think each of you can comment. How do I, as a parent, know if I should seek support or treatment for my child's screen use or social media use, etc.? How do I know that a threshold has been met? Matt?
I'm sure there's a lot of really great answers to this question, so I'll just offer a couple quick ones. The one that we hear the most in clinic is that their child doesn't seem like themselves. And since parents are really experts in their kids, that could be withdrawal, it could be aggression, it could run the gambit. But when we start to see that our kids are responding to their world differently, that's when I think those red flags should go up. And I think parents need to trust themselves that if they see it, that there's something to it.
Bushra?
As a child psychiatrist, so impairment in functioning is one thing that comes to mind. So if you're seeing that, your child is having decline in academic functioning, their grades are dropping, you're seeing that their relationships are sort of changing, those kind of, friction in certain areas. If you're noticing those changes, and Matt said it best, you know your child the best. And so if you start to see those changes, then seeking professional help is very important.
And Joe?
I think everybody already said it, but what I will say is it's not uncommon for me to meet with the family, whether it's about social media use, anxiety, depression, or whatever. It kind of brings them through the door, and for me to say, hey, everything's okay. Here are the ways to kind of tease things apart, and here's when to kind of come back, and we can kind of provide support. There's nothing wrong with coming in earlier. I think the challenge is not coming in or coming in too late, because then it's harder to kind of correct these behaviors. And oftentimes, parents, family members, loved ones will say, well, why didn't I do this sooner? And it's okay to come in on the front end. We're not going to say, why are you coming on in here wasting our time? We know you're concerned. We know you care. We do too.
So let's leave it there, and I'll say it's time now to answer questions submitted by our audience members. If you haven't yet submitted a question, please enter your question in the Q&A section of Zoom, but there are already a bunch, and some of them we've touched on a bit, but I think there's really a request to dive in a little bit deeper. So the first question, I'm gonna I'm gonna direct this one to Joe, but anybody can chime in. What is the recommended screen time limit for kids ages 11, 12, 14, and so on? And then how do video games and the social aspect of online multiplayers impact children? We haven't really talked about that aspect, especially around the question Cup mentions the toxic nature that other gamers can bring to that interaction. So Joe, but then I think everybody can have a crack at that one.
It's an important question. So first of all, thank you for asking it. And we can't cover everything. And I'm going to start with the second part of that question first. In terms of kind of the social nature of some of these online video games, I think it kind of depends on the community and who your son or daughter is playing with. First, there's even thinking about the past 2 weeks in families that I've seen. There is a young guy who gets together with his friends, once a week, and they play an hour of Minecraft. And it's a chance where they live in different parts of Maryland, and it gives them a chance to kind of stay connected, and do something together as a shared activity. That's a very different, positive social interaction versus somebody playing like a pickup Call of Duty game where you're playing with, young adults, and it's a more violent, antagonistic approach. So I think it's less about the specific the act of playing video games in a kind of multimodal or multiplayer fashion, but more what the content is and what that relationship is like with the other online people. In terms of an appropriate amount of time, I think it depends. Somebody is, and I would also say oftentimes parents and families will use the ability to earn screen time as a way to kind of shape behavior for other kinds of conditions. So I think we want to be a little bit mindful about that. So I don't think there is a specific set number, and I can dig up after this call what's in the American Academy of Pediatrics. But I think, again, to Matt's point, a lot of parents and families know their sons or daughters best. If somebody's getting really agitated and seeming like they can't control themselves after playing 30 minutes of video games, maybe we want to scale it back to 10 or 15, and then kind of reassess. If somebody's okay 30 minutes and it's a kind of positive social interaction, then we can kind of reassess and maybe increase that a little.
Bushra or Matt, you want to add to that, or?
Yeah, I can jump in. First, I should say that Joe, I envy your knowledge of all the different games and systems. I'm taking notes as you're talking.
I never ask somebody to do anything that I wouldn't do. So every Zelda
Smart.
Tears of the Kingdom, all of these games I go out and play. This is why I do a lot of VR research and other app research. It is a tough life, I will say.
Scholar and a gentleman. I think that when I recall being a kid and thinking about strangers and being told never to take to ever take candy from strangers. And I think to answer the question about these interactive video games, there's a false sense of security that kids have because they're playing these games in their family room, in their living room. And so they're sort of surrounded by familiar, safe things, but they're not really in a safe space sometimes when they're interacting with kind of adults who are not part of their community. As Joe suggested, they're sort of out there in a way that leaves them vulnerable. And so children and often parents, because parents don't even really understand sometimes the reach of where kids can meet these people. But I think we need to think about this sort of social global interaction as being potentially as unsafe as sort of getting some candy from a stranger. And so if we think about it that way, that doesn't mean that it means that we have to be cautious. It means that we have to be thoughtful in how we're supervising our kids. And it means we have to educate our kids on safety, even in their own living room. And that can feel overwhelming at times, but it's an important step towards safe consumption of these games.
Bushra,
Yeah, so
great
when
question. Oh, yes.
I was just going to say, when I started this and I was looking at some of the American Academy of Pediatrics timeframes that they were putting out there as more of a guardrail, we've kind of gone away from that, and they're looking more at balance now. So, balancing screen time with non-screen time activities. So I think the key word would be balance. making sure they're not spending excessive time on these games.
Bushra, one of the questions is, why is it that children with ADHD can sit for hours playing video games and can't sit for 30 minutes in the classroom for instruction?
Yeah, that's a great question. The games are moving so fast these days and the screen is changing so quickly. So it's that variable interval. So previously I used to do substance use work, and a lot of the literature that I read was on gambling and how, that variable interval is what brings people back, keeps them focused and makes them pull that lever. And the games are not any different. So just that change in screen, not knowing what's going to happen next in that game, that's what keeps, those kids who are vulnerable, especially the ones with, ADHD, kind of hooked, and yeah, kind of keeps them going, and they're not able to do the schoolwork because that, feels monotonous, feels boring is the word I hear, versus the games online.
A parent is describing their son as having a severe manifestations of autism, including being nonverbal. We didn't really get into this question, but often children in that situation will use screen for many reasons. And so there may be even more exposure. So the question is around, is it any worse for a child who is in this situation that has a more severe consequences of having autism and related conditions? Matt, maybe you want to take a crack at that one?
Yeah, sure. I think it's certainly a diagnosis like autism doesn't preclude someone from experiencing sort of the discomfort of having something unavailable that they really that they've come accustomed to having. I think that for some individuals with autism, they tend to have interests that are a little bit more restricted, and so that sort of can be a blessing and a curse in some way. The blessing end is you sort of know what really motivates your child, and in that way it feels sort of comforting that you sort of can point to something readily that will be useful in helping them enjoy their time and pass their time. On the other hand, the over-reliance on a single thing can be problematic because there's variability in life, and sometimes the battery runs out, and sometimes the Wi-Fi is bad. And so I think that the potential risk, particularly for individuals who have very narrow interests, is that when those things aren't available, they sort of lack any other skills with engaging with other types of things that might bring them pleasure. And so what I often recommend is, even though we know that a lot of our individuals with autism enjoy screen time, we want to make sure that we're still inserting access to other leisure types of activities, because we want our kids to have as big a toolbox as possible of things that that bring them joy and that pique their curiosity.
Here's a question I'm hoping each of you can just answer quickly, which is, how young are the children that you're treating in your practices, and how early in young lives are you seeing screen time issues? Bushra, you want to go first?
And so I start treating kids as young as 4, and a lot of times they come in for comorbid diagnosis. So they're not coming in for screen use per se, but they're coming in for other psychiatric concerns, like whether ADHD, they can't focus, those kind of things. So as young as 4 is what I treat. But what I see in the office is when they come in with their siblings and they've brought their 8-month-old, and they've the 8-month-old has a screen with them. So I am seeing, in terms of screen use, I'm definitely seeing sort of a pattern in the family. And so that gives me an opportunity to talk to the family about a family plan. How can you sort of instill habits and model behavior? I even explain to kids, because I use my laptop in the office while I'm seeing patients because I'm typing and taking notes, but I explain to them that I'm working, so sort of modeling that behavior and explaining to kids, why do I have my laptop out when I am maybe sending mixed messages? So kind of helping kids understand sort of what I'm doing.
Joe?
So see kids as young as 6 even up to 65, depending on who you are. But so I think it's a lifetime, life spectrum kind of concern. In terms of when you start to kind of see it, I would say there's not a kind of a particular developmental epoch or epoch, however you say that word, period. I think this is something that kind of creeps up over time in a lot of cases where we get a little bit reliant or too dependent or kind of very comfortable with handing a phone off to our son or daughter or something like that. And we start to see increasing amounts of screen time. And before we know it, it's an engaging kind of platform. You know, there was that question about schools and how to pay attention. Why can my son or my daughter pay attention to the video game, but not pay attention in class? There is a lot of creative content that goes into that video game. There's user interfaces. There's multiple millions of dollars. You know, what goes into that textbook? Maybe not as much. So I think, you know, if all of our educational content was created in the same way that's engaging, I think we'd actually have a lot better retention in that.
And Matt?
Yeah, in my clinic, I see children as young as 2, and we certainly see kids having big reactions to times when screens are unavailable, when they're or temporary unavailable, like the internet is loading, and when parents are telling them that they're done with their screen time for the day. So I like Joe said, there's really there's no specific point in life where this might not touch an individual and become an area for support. And in my case, we see a lot of kids with extreme reactivity and significant dysregulation around restricted access to screens.
So speaking of restricted access to screens, one of the questions is, what if I just said absolutely no screens? No phones, no use of social media, video games at all. Matt, what do you think? What impact might that have on a child?
Well, my first thought, just purely honestly, was good luck. Because we just live in a world where those things are everywhere, and children credibly say things like, "This is how I talk to my friends." And so we certainly don't want to take that away from them. At the same time, just because our child says something earnestly doesn't mean that it's all true. It certainly doesn't have to be the case that that's the only way they interact with their friends. So I think, and Joe and Busher also commented on this, that we need to understand this at the individual level. What is the right amount for the child at the current place that they're in? And that might start out at 0, but certainly that's not a long-term durable plan. So we need to get buy-in from our kids that access is going to be made available under certain conditions with certain limits, depending on their ability to show that they can regulate and understand what responsible use is. So I think I wish so much that screens were less ubiquitous, but unfortunately, I think we're past that point.
Joe, there's a question about the growing trend in parasocial relationships. So the idea here is that content creators, excuse me, are now the same age as their adolescent viewers and are sharing their lives through streams. It's as if that content creator is now your friend. How do you think about that kind of a phenomenon, and how do you advise parents and patients who are caught up in that kind of parasocial situation?
You know, it is hard. It's a you know, first of all, going back to kind of talking about what we learn from our patients and families that come in, you know, I learned all about Twitch, and somebody was telling me, well, that they really enjoyed watching somebody else play a video game. And then you watch them kind of stream and engage in that. And now there's YouTube and YouTube channels of where people are really getting connected, and the content creators are getting younger and younger. And now to the same age as the people that you're saying, Brad, are kind of consuming this content. I think it's hard because you see that person as yourself. it's no different, or you're kind of having that kind of connection with them, talking to them. I think thinking about, well, what are they getting out of this? If you're having a relationship, in person at the schoolyard, you're talking with your friend, you're engaging. The danger with a lot of these kind of pair relationships is everything is one way. Everything is well curated. So thinking a little bit about that, this is a bit artificial and setting some limits around that. But we really welcome kind of Bushra and Matt's kind of thoughts on this too.
One thing that I think we touched on briefly is like the fallacy that everything online is true. So a lot of times, like in these parasocial relationships, there's this fallacy that these celebrities, online celebrities or influencers, are experts in their area. And without labels online, young people are looking at social media platforms as their source of information. So I think that is quite problematic, and it is a slippery slope, because with the advent of AI, there's now AI influencers. So they're not even real people; they're sort of influencers that are artificially created.
So I really appreciate the following question. We have a viewer who describes themselves as a high school student who's always struggled with getting along with others at school, and has described a nearly non-existent social system within the school, and the internet therefore has become the social outlet for several years. So how do you suggest balancing screen time online to accommodate social needs, while at the same time putting the phone down or the device down to focus on other important tasks and needs? Really great question. And I think, Matt, you want to take the first crack at that?
Sure. I think it's great, first of all, that we have a high school student who's asking a question. I think that's phenomenal. We certainly don't want to discount this idea that if you feel more comfortable connecting with people online, that's not a bad thing. I think one thing we know is that we tend to do things that are comfortable because things that are uncomfortable feel hard. And we don't want to get so caught up in what's comfortable that hard things start to feel harder just because we're not doing them. So I think, just like that the rest of the panel suggested, things need to be done in moderation. Certainly do the things that feel like that are connecting you with other people and other activities. And if that's online, that's fantastic. But challenge yourself to take small steps towards other types of interactions and relationships, because we certainly know that by avoiding those things end up feeling so much harder and so much bigger than they really are.
Others want to comment? Great.
Happy to chime in real quick, building off of what Matt said. I think that there's oftentimes people find a lot of support in online communities. There's, the cool part about, for example, one of the young people I see is really interested in joining a D&D game, Dungeons and Dragons, that has been super popularized by Stranger Things on Netflix. Really, really cool. He can't find anybody in his immediate environment. Nobody in his school is doing it. So he's kind of tried to join an online game. So it's a kind of pro-social positive way to kind of do that in the absence of those other social interactions. So it makes sense exactly like what you're doing in the short term. But the hope is then you can kind of find other people who are into those same activities as your social network expands, as you're engaging in other activities. It's hard to do that if you don't step outside of your comfort zone. And when and how to do that, can be done on your own, or again, kind of reaching out and getting some additional support from a mental health professional.
I hate to say this because we have lots of really great questions still, but our time is up. Like I said, many great questions, so I regret that we can't get to them all. But I want to thank our experts and all of you, our guests, for attending and participating. We hope that you found this Exploring the Brain webinar to be informative and helpful. And you're going to receive an email from Kennedy Krieger shortly with links to the resources that we've referenced, that we're going to compile related to this topic. I hope you find them helpful. One of the questions I did see was, how can a grandparent get this information to parents who may not be on the same page with them in terms of social media? We're going to have that available, the resources and links to this recorded webinar as a way to get that information out. So thank you for that question as well. And we hope all of you will participate in future Exploring the Brain webinars. Follow Kennedy Krieger on your social media and listen to Your Child's Brain Monthly. That's a podcast that we produce with assistance from WYPR and Baltimore Public Media. And you can see those, you can get to those episodes of the podcast through kennedykrieger.org/YCB, on Kennedy Krieger's YouTube channel, or wherever you get your podcasts. So for more information about Kennedy Krieger Institute and how you can support our work, please visit our website at kennedykrieger.org. And thank you again to our panel and to all of you for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful evening. Thank you.